The morning sun had barely risen over the city courthouse when Sarah Williams pulled into the parking lot in her sleek black Toyota Camry. She checked her watch, 8:15 a.m., plenty of time before her 9 a.m. traffic hearing. As she stepped out of her car, her phone buzzed with a message from her team at the police department, but she decided it could wait. Today, she was just another citizen dealing with a traffic violation. Sarah straightened her navy blue blazer and grabbed her folder of documents. At 35, she carried herself with quiet confidence, earned through years of handling the city's most dangerous crisis situations. But today, she chose to leave her badge and credentials at home. This was a simple traffic court appearance, nothing more. The courthouse was already bustling with activity. Security guards nodded at the regular flow of people passing through metal detectors. Lawyers hurried past with briefcases full of papers, and nervous citizens clutched their traffic tickets. Sarah joined the line, patiently waiting her turn. Next, called the security guard. Sarah placed her purse on the conveyor belt and walked through the metal detector. The guard barely glanced at her as he waved her through, just another face in the morning crowd. Following the signs to courtroom 304, Sarah found herself in a long hallway lined with wooden benches. Several people were already waiting, some looking anxious, others bored. She took a seat and opened her folder, reviewing the details of her case one more time. The ticket had been issued 3 weeks ago. Sarah had been certain the light was yellow when she entered the intersection, but the traffic camera had caught her, and here she was. In her 15 years of driving, this was only her second ticket. The first had been a parking violation during her rookie year as a police officer. At precisely 8:45 a.m., a court officer opened the heavy wooden doors to courtroom 304. "All rise," came the traditional call, and everyone scrambled to their feet. Judge Robert Harrison entered, his black robe swishing as he took his place at the bench. Sarah observed the judge carefully. It was something she did automatically after years of reading people in crisis situations. Judge Harrison was in his early 60s, with steel gray hair and sharp blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His mouth was set in a thin line as he began calling cases. One by one, people stepped forward to plead their cases. Sarah noticed a pattern emerging. The judge seemed to have little patience this morning, especially with younger defendants. His fines were consistently on the higher end of the scale, and his lectures about responsibility and respect for the law grew longer with each case. When the clerk called Sarah Williams, she stood and walked confidently to the podium. The judge barely looked up from his papers as she approached. "Ms. Williams, you're here for running a red light on March 15th at the intersection of Oak and Main. How do you plead?" "Your Honor, while I respect the camera footage, I believe I entered the intersection while the light was still yellow. I have some pictures of the intersection and the timing of the yellow light that I'd like to present as evidence." Judge Harrison finally looked up, his expression hardening as his eyes met Sarah's. Something in his demeanor shifted, becoming more stern, more dismissive. "Ms. Williams, are you suggesting that our traffic cameras are incorrect?" Sarah maintained her professional composure, though she couldn't help but notice the change in his tone. "No, Your Honor. I'm simply presenting additional context for your consideration." The judge's fingers drummed impatiently on his desk. "The camera footage clearly shows your vehicle entering the intersection after the light turned red. These automated systems are precise, Ms. Williams. They don't make mistakes, and they certainly don't discriminate." There was something in the way he emphasized that last word that made several people in the courtroom shift uncomfortably. Sarah felt the weight of the moment, recognizing the familiar signs of bias she had encountered before. But she remained calm, her years of crisis negotiation training serving her well. Little did Judge Harrison know that the composed woman standing before him had talked down armed suspects, saved countless lives, and earned the respect of the entire police force. For now, she was just another face in his courtroom, about to receive what seemed like an unnecessarily harsh lesson in justice. Judge Harrison leaned forward in his chair, his wire-rimmed glasses catching the fluorescent light of the courtroom. The morning had already been long, but something about this case made him sit up straighter. He studied the woman before him with growing irritation. "Ms. Williams," he began, his voice carrying a sharp edge that made several people in the gallery look up from their phones. "Your driving record shows another violation from 8 years ago. Would you care to explain that?" Sarah kept her hands steady on the podium. "Yes, Your Honor. That was a parking ticket during my first year off. So this isn't your first time disregarding traffic laws, the judge interrupted, shuffling through her papers with exaggerated attention. Tell me, Ms. Williams, do you make it a habit to challenge authority? The courtroom had grown unusually quiet. Even the court clerk had stopped typing, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Sarah could feel the eyes of everyone present fixed on her back, but she maintained her professional demeanor. No, Your Honor. I have great respect for the law and... Respect. Judge Harrison's voice rose slightly. Running red lights and accumulating violations doesn't show respect, Ms. Williams. In fact, it shows a pattern of behavior that concerns me deeply. Sarah took a deep breath, using the same techniques she taught rookie negotiators. Stay calm. Choose words carefully. Don't escalate. Your Honor, if I may explain the circumstances of this current situation. The circumstances are quite clear from the traffic camera footage. Judge Harrison cut in again, holding up a printed photo. Your vehicle is clearly visible crossing the intersection 0.3 of a second after the light turned red. Are you suggesting the camera is incorrect? No, Your Honor. I'm simply trying to provide context about the yellow light timing at that particular intersection. I have documentation showing that the yellow light duration is shorter than the recommended safety standard. Judge Harrison's face reddened slightly. Ms. Williams, are you now questioning the city's traffic engineering department as well? First the cameras, now the traffic signals? A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Sarah noticed the bailiff shifting uncomfortably near the judge's bench. She had seen that look before, the look of someone witnessing an injustice but feeling powerless to intervene. Your Honor, I'm not questioning anyone's authority. I'm merely presenting relevant information for the court's consideration. The judge removed his glasses, polishing them with deliberate slowness. When he spoke again, his voice dripped with condescension. Ms. Williams, I've been serving on this bench for 23 years. I've heard every excuse, every explanation, and every attempt to avoid responsibility. But what concerns me most is your attitude. Sarah stood perfectly still, her face neutral despite the growing tension. Her phone vibrated silently in her pocket. Probably another message from her team, but she couldn't check it now. The fine for running a red light is typically $150, Judge Harrison continued, replacing his glasses. However, given your previous violation and your apparent reluctance to accept responsibility, I'm imposing a fine of $500. Additionally, I'm requiring you to attend a driver's education course. Gasps and whispers erupted from the gallery. Even the court clerk looked startled by the severity of the punishment. The fine was more than triple the usual amount, and driver's education was rarely required for a simple traffic violation. Your Honor, Sarah began, her voice steady despite the unfairness of the situation. I understand the seriousness of traffic violations, but this penalty seems... Seems what, Ms. Williams? Judge Harrison's voice was ice cold. Unfair. Excessive. Perhaps this will serve as a reminder that actions have consequences. This court will not tolerate disregard for the law, regardless of who you are or what excuses you present. The implied message in his words hung heavy in the air. Sarah recognized the familiar sting of prejudice wrapped in the guise of justice, but her years of crisis negotiation had taught her when to speak and when to remain silent. This was a moment for the latter. Just then, her phone vibrated again, more insistently this time. Little did Judge Harrison know that his theatrical display of authority was about to be interrupted by something far more urgent than a traffic violation. The sharp sound of emergency sirens cut through the tense atmosphere of the courtroom. At first, no one paid much attention. Sirens weren't unusual in the busy downtown area. But then the courthouse's internal warning system began to flash, its red lights casting an eerie glow across the wood-paneled walls. Sarah's phone buzzed for the third time, and now she understood why. As she reached for it, the bailiff's radio crackled to life. Code 451 at Carlton Building. Armed suspect, multiple hostages. All available crisis negotiators respond immediately. The Carlton Building was right next door to the courthouse, connected by a sky bridge on the third floor. Sarah could already hear the commotion building outside, police sirens, helicopters, and the general chaos that accompanied such situations. Judge Harrison banged his gavel. This court is still in session. Ms. Williams, we are not finished with your... The bailiff, Officer Mike Rodriguez rushed forward to the bench. His face showed clear recognition when he glanced at Sarah. "Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption, but—" He leaned in closer, speaking in what was meant to be a whisper, but carried in the quiet courtroom. "Sir, that's Sarah Williams. She's our lead crisis negotiator. We need her right now." The change in Judge Harrison's expression was almost comical. His stern facade cracked as his eyes widened, darting between the bailiff and Sarah. The woman he had just lectured about responsibility was suddenly transformed in his eyes. Sarah was already in motion, her court appearance forgotten. She pulled her badge from her purse, the one she'd decided to bring just in case of emergency. "Officer Rodriguez, what's the situation?" Her voice had changed, carrying an authority that made several people in the gallery sit up straighter. "Armed suspect on the 15th floor," Rodriguez reported quickly. "3, possibly 4 hostages. Suspect is demanding to speak with someone in charge. SWAT setting up, but they need you there now." Judge Harrison stood up, his robe swishing. "Ms. Williams, are you actually—" "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah replied, already removing her blazer to reveal the bulletproof vest she always wore under her clothes. It was a habit she'd developed over years of being called to emergencies at a moment's notice. "I'm the head of the Crisis Negotiation Unit, and right now I have a situation to handle." Her phone buzzed again. This time she answered it, speaking in the calm, measured tone that had saved countless lives. "Williams here. I'm in the courthouse. I can be there in 2 minutes. Tell the suspect we're working on his demands. Don't let SWAT move in until I assess the situation." The gallery watched in amazement as Sarah transformed from a traffic court defendant into a commanding presence. She pulled her hair back into a tight ponytail and retrieved a small earpiece from her purse. Years of experience had taught her to always be prepared. "Your Honor," she said, turning to the still stunned judge, "I request a brief recess to handle this emergency. I'll return to address my traffic violation once the situation is secure." Judge Harrison could only nod, his earlier arrogance replaced by visible embarrassment. The same woman he had patronized about responsibility was now taking charge of a life-or-death situation with remarkable professionalism. The bailiff held the courtroom door open as Sarah strode out, already coordinating with her team through her earpiece. "Get me the building layout, and I need background on the suspect, any social media, employment records, recent life events. Has he made any specific demands yet?" As she disappeared down the hallway, the courtroom erupted in excited whispers. Judge Harrison sank back into his chair, his face a mix of shock and shame. He'd spent 20 minutes lecturing a highly trained professional about responsibility and respect for authority, only to discover she regularly held lives in her hands. Through the courtroom windows, they could see police cars surrounding the Carlton building, their lights flashing against the morning sun. And there was Sarah, walking purposefully through the chaos, her presence already bringing a sense of order to the scene. The real question now wasn't about a traffic violation. It was about how many lives she would save today. Judge Harrison stood at his chamber window, watching the scene unfold at the Carlton building. From his third-floor vantage point, he could see everything clearly. Police cars formed a tight circle around the building, their lights painting the morning in flashing red and blue. News vans were already arriving, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky. But what caught his attention most was Sarah Williams. Just 15 minutes ago, she had stood before him as a traffic violator. Now, she moved through the chaos like a conductor leading an orchestra. Her commands, carried to him through the open window, were clear and confident. "Get those news helicopters back. We can't risk the suspect seeing our positions on live TV," she called out, her voice carrying the same authority he had tried to use against her in his courtroom. The difference was, hers was earned through years of saving lives, not simply wearing a black robe. The bailiff, Officer Rodriguez, knocked and entered the judge's chambers. "Your Honor, Ms. Williams asked me to update you on the situation. She thought you might be concerned about court security." Judge Harrison nodded, trying to maintain his dignity. "Yes, thank you. What's the status?" "The suspect is a former employee who was fired last week. He's holding 3 people hostage in the executive office. Ms. Williams is preparing to make first contact." Rodriguez paused, then added, "She's the best we got, Your Honor. Last year alone, she resolved 32 hostage situations without a single casualty. The judge's face flushed as he remembered his harsh words about responsibility and respect for authority. Through the window, he watched as Sarah put on a tactical vest and checked her communication equipment. Her movements were precise, practiced, professional. The courthouse lobby below had been transformed into a command center. Computer screens showed building layouts and security camera feeds. Sarah stood at the center, studying the displays while giving instructions to her team. Remember, this man lost his job. His world has fallen apart. We need to show him there are better solutions than violence. Judge Harrison couldn't help but notice how everyone listened when she spoke. Even the heavily armed SWAT team members nodded respectfully at her directions. This was true authority, not demanded, but earned through competence and compassion. A young police officer rushed up to Sarah with a tablet. "Ms. Williams, we found his social media posts. Lots of anger about the firing, but also mentions of a sick daughter and medical bills." Sarah nodded, taking the tablet. "That's our opening. He's not just angry about losing his job, he's scared for his child. Get me more details about the daughter's condition, and find out if his former company's health insurance has already been cut off." From his window, Judge Harrison watched as she approached the building entrance. Her voice came through clearly as she spoke into her phone, now connected to the office where the suspect waited. "Mr. Davidson, this is Sarah Williams with the Crisis Negotiation Unit. I heard about your daughter Emily. It must be terrifying, dealing with her illness and losing your job at the same time." The judge couldn't hear the suspect's response, but he saw Sarah nod encouragingly. "I understand, Mr. Davidson. Really, I do. And I want to help you find a better way through this. Your daughter needs her father at home, not in jail. Let's talk about how we can make that happen." Officer Rodriguez's radio crackled. "Suspect is responding positively. Ms. Williams has established report." Judge Harrison sank into his chair, the irony of the situation hitting him full force. The same woman he had lectured about responsibility was now teaching him a profound lesson about prejudice and presumption. In his courtroom, he had seen only what he expected to see: another traffic violator making excuses. How wrong he had been. Through the window, he watched as Sarah continued her careful negotiation, her calm voice carrying up to his chambers. She was saving lives while he sat in his office, confronting his own biases and the damage they could cause. The tables had indeed turned, and the lesson was clear. True justice required looking beyond surface judgments to see the real person standing before you. Sarah stood in the empty office on the 14th floor, just one level below the crisis. Her team had set up a temporary command post here, with monitors showing security camera feeds from above. Through the ceiling, she could hear footsteps, Mr. Davidson pacing back and forth with his hostages. "Tell me more about Emily." Sarah spoke softly into her phone, maintaining the connection with the desperate father above. "How old is she now?" "6?" Davidson's voice cracked. "She's only 6, and the doctors say she needs surgery next month. But without insurance." His voice trailed off into a sob. Sarah signaled to her team silently, pointing to one of her colleagues who was already making calls to local hospitals. "Mr. Davidson, I want you to know we're looking into options for Emily's medical care right now. There are programs that can help, regardless of insurance status." The hostages sat quietly in the corner of the executive office, their faces tense but composed. Sarah could see them through the security feed, 2 women and 1 man, all wearing business attire. They seemed to understand the gravity of their situation but weren't panicking, which was helpful. "The company doesn't care," Davidson continued, his voice rising. 15 years I worked there, and they threw me away like garbage. My daughter could die because of them." Sarah kept her voice steady, using the techniques she had perfected over hundreds of negotiations. "I hear your anger, and it's justified. But right now, we need to focus on Emily. She needs her father. These people you're holding, they can't help Emily, but I can, if you'll let me." Her colleague gave her a thumbs up. They'd found a children's hospital with a financial assistance program that could cover Emily's surgery. Sarah felt a small surge of hope. This was the opening she needed. "Mr. Davidson, I have some good news about Emily's surgery. But I need you to do something first. Show me you're the father Emily needs right now. Let one of the hostages go, and I'll tell you about a program that could cover her entire operation." There was a long pause. Sarah held her breath, watching the monitor intently. Then Davidson moved toward the hostages. The lady in the blue suit, she has kids. She showed me pictures. She can go. Sarah nodded to her team. That's a good choice, Mr. Davidson. You're doing the right thing. She watched as the woman in blue carefully stood and walked to the door. Within moments, she was being escorted to safety by SWAT team members. Over the next hour, Sarah continued building trust. She shared details about the hospital's program, connected Davidson with a social worker by phone, and gradually helped him see a way forward that didn't involve violence. Your daughter doesn't need a father in prison, Sarah reminded him gently. She needs you there for her surgery, holding her hand. These people you're holding, they have families too. Show Emily that her dad is someone who does the right thing, even when life is unfair. Finally, after 3 tense hours of negotiation, Davidson agreed to release the remaining hostages. Sarah talked him through putting down his weapon and surrendering peacefully. As SWAT officers led him out in handcuffs, he looked at Sarah with tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. "Will you make sure Emily knows I'm sorry?" Sarah touched his shoulder gently. "I'll personally make sure she knows you thought of her first in the end, and I'll follow up about that surgery program." News cameras captured the peaceful resolution, the reporters already crafting headlines about the skilled negotiator who had prevented tragedy. But Sarah wasn't thinking about the headlines. She was making notes about Emily's case, determined to ensure the little girl got her surgery. As the excitement died down and the police began clearing the scene, Sarah checked her watch. It was almost time for afternoon traffic court. She had a feeling her return to Judge Harrison's courtroom would be very different from her morning appearance. Judge Harrison sat alone in his chambers, the events of the morning playing over and over in his mind. The local news channel played quietly on his small office TV, showing footage of the hostage situation's peaceful resolution. Sarah Williams' face filled the screen as reporters praised her skilled handling of the crisis. Senior crisis negotiator Sarah Williams successfully prevented what could have been a tragic situation today, the reporter announced. Sources say her quick response and expert communication skills were key in securing the release of all 3 hostages without any injuries. The judge picked up Sarah's traffic court file from his desk, his hand slightly shaking. He began reading through her background information more carefully this time, information he had earlier skimmed with prejudiced eyes. What he found made his face burn with shame. Sarah Williams had been with the police department for 12 years. She had received multiple commendations for bravery and excellence. Last year, she had been named Officer of the Year for her work in establishing a new crisis intervention program. The woman he had treated so dismissively was, in fact, one of the city's most respected public servants. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. It was Officer Rodriguez, the bailiff. "Your Honor, Ms. Williams has returned for her traffic court appearance. The afternoon session starts in 10 minutes. Judge Harrison nodded slowly, his usual confidence shaken. "Thank you, Rodriguez. Tell me, what do you know about her?" The bailiff stood straighter. "Sir, she's a legend in the department. 3 years ago, she topped a man out of jumping from the city bridge while hanging onto the railing herself. Last Christmas, she spent 16 hours negotiating with a troubled veteran who was threatening his family. Saved everyone. She teaches crisis negotiation at the academy now." Each word felt like a personal rebuke to the judge. He remembered his condescending tone from the morning, his assumptions, his unnecessarily harsh fine. He had let his biases cloud his judgment, the very thing he had sworn an oath to avoid. Standing at his office window, he watched as news vans packed up their equipment. The crisis was over, but his personal crisis of conscience was just beginning. In all his years on the bench, he had prided himself on being fair and impartial. Today had shown him how far he had strayed from those ideals. "Rodriguez," he said quietly, "when court resumes, I'd like you to invite the press to stay. They should hear what I have to say." The bailiff nodded, understanding in his eyes. As he left, Judge Harrison opened his bottom desk drawer and pulled out a small mirror he kept there. He stared at his reflection, the same face that had looked down at Sarah Williams with such unearned superiority just hours ago. He thought about his own daughter, a first-year law student. How would he feel if someone prejudged her based on appearance rather than ability? The thought made him wince. Taking off his judicial robe, he inspected it carefully. This simple black garment represented justice, fairness, and equality under the law. Today, he had failed to live up to those ideals. Putting it back on, he made a silent promise to do better. The afternoon session would start soon. Sarah Williams would again stand before his bench, but this time, everything would be different. This time, he would see her for who she really was, not through the lens of his prejudices, but through the clear glass of truth. Judge Harrison gathered his papers and stood up straight. In a few minutes, you would have the opportunity to right a wrong. It wouldn't be easy. Public admissions of failure never were. But if Sarah Williams could risk her life to save others, he could risk his pride to acknowledge his mistake. As he prepared to return to the courtroom, the TV still played footage of the morning's events. Sarah's voice came through clearly. Sometimes the hardest thing is to admit when we're wrong, but it's also the most important. She had been talking about the hostage taker, but her words struck Judge Harrison like a gavel's bang. The time had come for him to practice what he had preached about responsibility and accountability. The afternoon session of traffic court was unusually crowded. News reporters filled the back rows, their cameras ready. Word had spread quickly about the morning's events, and everyone wanted to see what would happen when Sarah Williams returned to face Judge Harrison. Sarah sat quietly in the front row, still wearing her professional outfit from earlier, though now with a slight wrinkle from her active morning. Her phone was finally silent, the crisis resolved. She noticed the unusually large crowd but maintained her calm demeanor. "All rise," called Officer Rodriguez as Judge Harrison entered the courtroom. The judge looked different somehow, humbler, his usual stern expression replaced by one of thoughtful consideration. Instead of immediately sitting down, he remained standing at his bench. "Before we begin today's afternoon session," Judge Harrison spoke, his voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom, "I have an important matter to address." He turned his attention to Sarah. "Ms. Williams, would you please approach the bench?" Sarah rose smoothly and walked forward, just as she had done that morning. But this time, the judge stepped down from his elevated position to stand on the same level as her. A murmur of surprise rippled through the courtroom. "Ms. Williams," Judge Harrison began, his voice now carrying a note of genuine respect, "this morning, I made a serious error. I allowed preconceptions and biases to influence my judgment. I treated you with unwarranted suspicion and condescension." The room fell completely silent. Even the reporters stopped writing, their pens frozen mid-sentence. Sarah stood quietly, her expression professional but softened by understanding. "Your actions today," the judge continued, "demonstrated not just professional excellence, but the highest levels of responsibility in public service. The very qualities I accused you of lacking were the ones you exemplified in saving 3 lives." He turned to address the entire courtroom. "As a judge, my duty is to deliver justice fairly and without prejudice. Today, I failed in that duty. My treatment of Ms. Williams was influenced by biases I didn't even realize I held. This is unacceptable in any situation, but particularly from someone in my position." Sarah watched as the judge reached for her traffic citation. With deliberate movements, he tore it in half. "The fine I imposed this morning was not about justice, it was about power and prejudice. I am dismissing this citation, Ms. Williams. But more importantly, I owe you a sincere apology." To everyone's amazement, Judge Harrison extended his hand to Sarah. "I am deeply sorry for my behavior this morning. You showed me what true authority and responsibility look like. Not through words from a bench, but through actions that saved lives." Sarah shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, Your Honor. We all have moments that teach us to look beyond our first impressions." The judge nodded, appreciating her gracious response. "Ms. Williams, would you be willing to help our court staff with some training sessions on bias recognition and crisis management? I believe we could all learn valuable lessons from your experience." "I would be honored, Your Honor," Sarah replied with a small smile. Judge Harrison turned back to the crowded courtroom. "Let this be a lesson to all of us. True justice requires us to look past our assumptions and see each person as they really are. I was wrong this morning, and I am grateful for the opportunity to acknowledge that mistake and learn from it." Cameras flashed as reporters captured the moment. But this wasn't just about a photo opportunity. Everyone in the courtroom could feel that they were witnessing something genuine, a powerful person admitting their mistakes and committing to change. As Sarah returned to her seat, Judge Harrison spoke one final time. "Ms. Williams, thank you for showing me what real responsibility looks like. You taught me a lesson I won't forget." He picked up his gavel. "This court stands adjourned for the day. When we return tomorrow, we'll begin with a renewed commitment to true justice. Justice that sees beyond surface appearances to the real person standing before us." 3 months after the incident, the city courthouse looked different. New posters about bias awareness decorated the walls, and a large photograph of Sarah Williams teaching a crisis management class hung in the main hallway. The image served as a daily reminder to everyone who worked there about the importance of looking beyond first impressions. Judge Harrison sat in his newly reformed courtroom, watching as Sarah conducted her weekly training session with the court staff. She had become a regular presence in the building, teaching not just about crisis management, but also about recognizing and overcoming unconscious bias. "Every person who walks through those doors has a story," Sarah explained to the group of judges, clerks, and bailiffs. "Our job is not to write their story for them based on how they look, but to listen and understand who they really are." The judge smiled, remembering how his own story with Sarah had started. That traffic court session could have remained just another example of everyday prejudice. Instead, it had sparked a transformation in the entire courthouse culture. News of the judge's public apology had spread far beyond their city. Other courts had reached out, asking about their new training program. Sarah's dual role as crisis negotiator and court trainer had become a model for other jurisdictions looking to address similar issues. Today's session was special. They were celebrating the completion of the first round of comprehensive bias training for all courthouse employees. The room was packed with people who had gone through the program, from security guards to senior judges. When I first stood in traffic court that morning, Sarah addressed the group. "I had two choices. I could have gotten angry about being unfairly judged, or I could see it as an opportunity for change. Thanks to Judge Harrison's courage in admitting his mistake, we chose change." Judge Harrison stood up to speak next. He no longer wore his judicial robe during these training sessions. It was his way of showing that learning happened best when people met as equals. "3 months ago, I thought I knew what authority looked like," he said, his voice carrying the wisdom of hard-learned lessons. "Ms. Williams taught me that true authority comes from understanding, not power. Every day now, I ask myself, am I seeing the person before me, or just my assumptions about them?" The changes weren't just symbolic. The courthouse had implemented new procedures to help prevent bias in decision-making. Every judge now had a checklist of questions to consider before making rulings. Training in crisis management and de-escalation had become mandatory for all court officers. Even Mr. Davidson's story had a positive ending. Thanks to Sarah's follow-up, his daughter Emily had received her surgery through the hospital's assistance program. She was recovering well, and Davidson was getting counseling while awaiting his own court date. Sarah had made sure his case was assigned to Judge Harrison. As the training session ended, Sarah checked her phone, another crisis call, but now she had a whole network of trained professionals who understood her work. The court automatically rescheduled any appointments when she was called to emergencies. "Keep learning, keep growing," she told the group as she prepared to leave. Every person deserves to be seen for who they really are. Judge Harrison watched her go, thinking about how one morning in traffic court had led to all this. His own daughter, now a practicing lawyer, had told him how proud she was of his public admission of bias and commitment to change. The courthouse security guard held the door for Sarah as she hurried out. "Be safe out there, Ms. Williams," he called after her. 3 months ago, he might not have even noticed her passing by. Now, like everyone else in the building, he knew her story. As the day's regular court session began, Judge Harrison put his robe back on, but now it felt different, less like a symbol of authority and more like a reminder of responsibility. Each case that came before him was a chance to prove that real change was possible, one decision at a time.